Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 26 April 2024. 688 years ago today, on Thursday, 26 April 1336, the Italian poet Petrarch climbed Mount Ventoux, and when he returned from his hike, he wrote a letter to his father about the hike that's still extant. Petrarch's ascent of Mount Ventoux has been described as the first modern instance of climbing a mountain simply to enjoy the view, and Petrarch himself has been called the first modern man, rightly or wrongly. Both claims that Petrarch was modern and that he was not at all modern have been made, and both claims have been disputed. So was Petrarch already modern in the early 14th century, or was he still a thoroughly medieval man? Petrarch's description of the view that he had when he went up Mount Ventoux was essentially modern. Quote, "The sinking sun and the lengthening shadows of the mountain were already warning us that the time was near at hand when we must go. As if suddenly wakened from sleep, I turned about and gazed toward the west. I was unable to discern the summits of the Pyrenees, which form the barrier between France and Spain, not because of any intervening obstacle that I know of, but owing simply to the insufficiency of our mortal vision. But I could see with utmost clearness off to the right the mountains of the region about Lyon, and to the left the Bay of Marseille and the waters that lash the shore of Aigues-Mortes. Although all these places were so distant, it would require a journey of several days to reach them. Under our very eyes flowed the Rhone," unquote. So far, Petrarch sounds thoroughly modern, but it doesn't end there. He brought a book with him on his hike, so Petrarch was my kind of tourist, and he pulled it out when he was at the summit. Specifically, he brought with a copy of St. Augustine's Confessions, and he says in his letter to his dad, quote, "While I was thus dividing my thoughts, now turning my attention to some terrestrial object that lay before me, now raising my soul, as I had done my body, to higher planes, it occurred to me to look into my copy of St. Augustine's Confessions," unquote. And as it would happen, of course, just by chance, he opened up his copy of the Confessions to this passage, quote, "And men go about to wonder at the heights of the mountains and the mighty waves of the sea and the wide sweep of rivers and the circuit of the ocean and the revolution of the stars, but they themselves they consider not," unquote. Petrarch felt scolded by this from Augustine, so he was still sufficiently medieval to respond to Augustine's admonition to mind his soul rather than the world. It's worth pointing out here that the fact Augustine would write something like this means that Petrarch wasn't the first person to marvel at natural scenery. So if marveling at natural scenery means you're modern, we could certainly find modern people in the ancient world. And any number of other ancient writers might have similarly scolded Petrarch for his worldliness. Not only Christians like Augustine, but ancient pagan philosophers you might have drawn a similar lesson from them. But it was Augustine, and it was Augustine's worldview that posed the question to Petrarch of the value of his experience. Hans Blumenberg characterized Petrarch's ascent of Mount Ventoux as a moment that oscillates between epochs. So not purely medieval, not purely modern, but partaking of both, you could say. Here's Blumenberg, quote, "As one of the great moments that oscillate indecisively between epochs, I would like to mark April 26, 1336, when Petrarch ascended Mount Ventoux. Purely out of desire," he writes, "to see the unusual altitude of the place. The comparatively modest excursion is stylized into a symbolic venture in which desire, verging on the sinful, and the pious timidity before what he had never set foot upon, daring and fear, presumption and self-recollection, combine in an event whose attributes one could label deeply medieval just as much as early modern. Petrarch's appeal to the ancient example of King Philip of Macedonia on Mount Haemus in Thessaly plays a role here, just as does the entire Ciceronian justification that such a venture might be excusable for a young man who is not involved in public affairs. Nature offers resistance to the intrusion. Petrarch's portrayal of his goings astray and exertions gives it the appearance of a prodigious undertaking. An old herdsman appears as a cautioner who himself had once reached the summit under the impulse of youthful spirit, but had brought away only repentance and hardship. One of the typical motives of curiositas, reservation, and prohibition enhances the appetite. All this presents itself as a monstrous human temptation, and the experience on the summit accords with his stupendi sumus steti. I stood as though amazed, unquote. Probably Blumenberg's interpretation of Petrarch's hike as being caught between epochs is a more defensible interpretation than seeing it as already fully modern or as being still entirely medieval. And this could be said of any number of events and processes taking place at the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era. Just as there are geographical borderlines where two distinct regions meet, so too there are historical borderlands where two epochs meet. How wide is that border? How wide is the border of a historical borderland? This is one of the problems of periodization in history. 1336 would be an unusually early date for the advent of modernity, but earlier dates have been proposed. Much later dates have also been proposed. Philip Deileiter, in his lectures on medieval history, argues that essential features of the medieval period endured up into the 18th century. That would be an unusually late end date for the advent of modernity, but the case could be made for it. Such a periodization would involve lopping off the sub-period of early modernity, which is often given as 1500 to 1800, and leaving this as part of the Middle Ages. We run into a similar problem with the boundary between antiquity and the Middle Ages, which is another historical border. We can set that division relatively early with the first signs of Rome's collapse, or we could set it rather late, as Pirenne does with the Pirenne thesis, which brings antiquity up to the time of Islam. For Pirenne, it's the rise of Islam that is the great discontinuity in history and not the failure of Roman institutions in the West. We can set the end of antiquity even later if we bring classical antiquity all the way up to 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Turks, since up to this point, some part of Rome had survived up to that point. This is a date more than 100 years after Petrarch climbed Mount Ventoux, so that if we mark the end of antiquity at 1453 AD and the beginning of modernity with Petrarch's ascent of Mount Ventoux in 1336, antiquity and modernity overlapped for a century, and the Middle Ages ceased to exist. I could even argue that this is not really a disadvantage, since the Middle Ages have been posited as an age lying between two ages, which we can see merely from the etymology of the word medieval, which is between medi, two ages, evil. So the medieval period is an age between two ages. Antiquity and modernity are, in this view, well-marked and distinctive civilizations, while the medieval world was a mere transition between these two ages. So this makes the medieval world a long, 1,000-year, millennium-long transition from antiquity to modernity. But we can also see antiquity, medievalism, and modernity as historical peers that are, we could say, temporally equipollent. It is a commonplace that the early modern period extends from about 1500 to about 1800. A friend of mine once suggested that since the period of 1500 to 1800 is called early modern period, we could then call the period from 1800 to 2100 the middle modern period. I love this idea, and I suggested that then we can go a step further and say that the period from 2100 to 2400 would be the late modern period. Allowing for some transition between these, this periodization gives us a millennium of modernity, so that modern civilization taken on its own is approximately temporally equipollent with the millennium of medieval history, or a millennium of classical antiquity. This, in turn, makes it possible to conceive modernity as a civilization in its own right, with its own heft, as it were, comparable to other great periods of civilization within Western history. Moreover, this periodization means that we are 2/3 of the way through the Middle Modern period, which might also be called High Modernism by analogy with the High Middle Ages. If we take the Middle Ages to be roughly 500 to 1500 AD, then the 13th century, which has been called the greatest of centuries by at least one historian, specifically James J. Walsh, who wrote a book about it, the 13th century roughly corresponds in its position within the medieval millennium to where we stand within the modern millennium. Though we could, perhaps with more plausibility, think of our time as a time of trouble that better resembles the 14th century, which is what Barbara Tuchman called a distant mirror, which is to say, a mirror of our own turbulent and troubled times. According to this reasoning, it was the 19th century that was a high point of modern civilization, and we are past the peak, inhabiting the declining decadence of high modern civilization. This periodization also means that we are about halfway through modernism taken as a whole, with half of modernity behind us and half of it still yet to come. So what should we expect from the remainder of modernity? What historical forces of modernity have yet to play out? To answer that, we have to ask, what are the historical forces that shape modernity? And how are they different from, say, the historical forces that shape the Middle Ages? Medieval Western civilization was centered on Catholic Christianity as interpreted within the feudal system of Western Europe. This qualification of saying it's within the feudal framework of Europe could be said to be redundant, since the medieval Catholic Church was itself thoroughly feudal in its organization, though whether feudalism flowed from the wider society into the church or feudalism flowed into wider society through the vehicle of the church, or both by turns in different places and different times, is another matter, and I won't discuss that, at least at the present time. Orthodox Christianity separated itself from Catholic Christianity during this period in the Great Schism, well before the High Middle Ages, or certainly well before the 13th century, the greatest of centuries. And it came to define a distinct sphere of civilization, and indeed, Orthodox Christianity does to this day still define a distinct sphere of civilization, adjacent to, but not part of the mainstream of Western civilization. I argue that it is the Enlightenment which slowly took shape in the early modern period and which has achieved several mature expressions in the middle modern period that is central to modern Western civilization and analogous in our experience to the role of the church in medieval experience. We can project the late modern period will be the period of the slow exhaustion and disintegration of the Enlightenment project, with first stirrings of new ideas that will eventually be incorporated into a new project that will define a transformed Western civilization after the high modern epoch, and after the entire after the modern millennium, if there is any future for Western civilization at all, which we don't know at this time. If Western civilization should definitively fail without issue, that is to say, if the late modern period is the decline unto extinction of Western civilization, in this scenario, there will be no stirring of new ideas within that as the modern period is declining and something else is growing, because nothing else is growing from within. There's only exhaustion and emptiness of the tradition. Even if this is the case, Western civilization will still have endured for about 3,000 years, which puts it in a class with Egyptian civilization, which endured almost 3,000 years. Few traditions endure as long as with any kind of recognizable continuity as that. So it's already exceptional in that respect. If this should be the fate of Western civilization, that it should exhaust itself after about 3,000 years, roughly divided between 1,000 years of antiquity, 1,000 years of the medieval world, and 1,000 years of modernity, then the Middle Ages will represent the center of the entire 3,000-year history of Western civilization. As each distinctive constituent civilization of the Western tradition marked its high point near the center of its millennium, the Middle Ages would be the center of the entire tradition, and the center of the Middle Ages would then be the center of the entire tradition. Earlier, I said that we can make the Middle Ages disappear if we take antiquity up to 1453 and start modernity in 1336. This is, in one sense, a technical concern of historiography, but it's also evaluation. How we cut up time into periods reflects something about what we think of them. If we see the civilization of the Middle Ages as the center of the entire Western tradition, or we could say the pivot, or if we even prefer another metaphor, the hinge of Western history, this too can be interpreted as a technical concern of historiographical periodization, but it is at the same time also a evaluation of that period. This is the valuation that makes medieval civilization central to the Western tradition and the expression of what is essential to that tradition. It is also a way to express that the height of medieval civilization is the height of the entirety of the Western tradition. In this way, we would not be going far wrong to identify Petrarch's ascent of Mount Ventoux near the center of the Middle Ages as the high point, the culmination of the whole of Western civilization. So Petrarch, on the summit of Mount Ventoux 688 years ago today, may have been the apogee of Western civilization. So thanks for listening.